and welcome to the Kalamopod, the one and only podcast on themes in classical Islamic theology, hosted by me, Hannah Alvine. Ardent listeners of the Kalamopod will know that in a previous episode, we looked at the emergence of Islam in 7th century Arabia and at some of the themes which the Quran talks about and which would later give classical Islamic theologians plenty of reason to puzzle their heads over. Well, Islam might have emerged on the Arabian Peninsula, but within 120 years of Muhammad's death, Muslims managed to create a vast empire that stretched well beyond the Arabian Peninsula. When Muhammad died in 632, he was succeeded by the so-called rightly guided caliphs, in Arabic, al-Khulafa ar-Rashidun. Well, at least according to the Sunni position, they were rightly guided. The Shia took a somewhat different view on this, but more about this contentious issue at a later point. The first among these four rightly guided caliphs was Abu Bakr, then Omar, then Uthman, and finally Ali. Under their rule, and within only 30 years, the Islamic Empire expanded northwards and came to include territories of the defeated Sasanian Empire, as well as westwards, where Muslim armies managed to conquer North African territories of the Byzantine Empire. The rightly guided caliphs, in turn, were succeeded by the Umayyad dynasty, which, within the next 100 years, managed to expand the Islamic Empire even further. By the year 750, large parts of North Africa and Spain, as well as territories in Central Asia, were under Muslim rule. At that time, Muslims were actually a minority ruling elite in their own empire, which included a great number of peoples of other languages, faiths, and traditions. With the annexation of the Sasanian Empire, a majority of Zoroastrian subjects became part of the Muslim Empire. In Syria, Palestine, Iraq, Egypt, and North Africa, Muslims encountered a majority of Christians. With the expansion into Afghanistan and Central Asia, the empire came to include Buddhists as well. And finally, there were pagans and Jewish communities throughout the Middle East. But why is this important for this episode of the Kalamopod? Because this was the historical, social, cultural, and religious context in which the science of kalam, or Islamic theology, emerged. And what is more, some academics have argued that the emergence of Islamic theology was inextricably linked to this multifaceted environment and cannot be understood without it. The theories about the origin of Islamic theology proposed by these academics could be labeled externalist, precisely because they put so much emphasis on external influences when it comes to the origin of the science of kalam. Yet, as so often in academia, and that's what keeps it rather interesting, there is not one theory about the origin of Islamic theology, and other academics have proposed more internalist theories, according to which the emergence of theological debates was an intra-Islamic phenomenon. Let us then start with the so-called externalist theories. The scholars who champion these theories have argued that in order to understand the origin of Islamic theology, we need to look at the origin of its characteristic mode of argumentation. Already the earliest extant theological texts have a characteristic style, which assumes the form of something of a debate with a hypothetical interlocutor or opponent. The theologian uses the interlocutor as a rhetorical device to introduce a problem or a possible objection to his own position. This debating style also gives the theologian the opportunity to reveal the absurdity of his opponent's position and thereby to vindicate his own. Here's an example from Al-Ash'ari's Kitab al-Lumma. Al-Ash'ari died in the year 936 and does therefore not belong to the very early theologians. But his Kitab al-Lumma is one of the earliest surviving kalam works we have. He opens the chapter on the creation of the world with a question, which he puts into an interlocutor's mouth. In sa'ala sa'ilun faqala. If someone were to ask and say, what is the proof that there is for creation a creator? The answer follows immediately and is introduced by Qila. It would be said, the proof is, and then the actual proof follows. This question-answer format runs like a thread through Al-Ash'ari's entire work. But Al-Ash'ari also uses the interlocutor in order to introduce an objection, which he then goes on to refute. فَإِنْ أَرَدُنَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ. If they were to object to us, it would be said to them. Now, the scholars who subscribe to externalist theories of the origin of kalam have argued that Islamic theologians might have adopted this debating style from Syriac Christian disputation literature, which they came to know of in the wake of the expansion of the Islamic Empire. This literature, which already existed in the 7th century, so well before Islamic theology began, uses this exact same style in Christological debates about Jesus' human and divine natures. Christian theologians would discuss a given problem by posing the question to a hypothetical interlocutor. Do you believe this or that? And would then leap into a systematic refutation of the alternative which they considered incorrect and an explication of the correct view. So, seeing these parallels in how Christian and Islamic theological works were presented, it might then be that Muslims learned these techniques through contact and exchange with Christians, or through Christian converts to Islam. And after all, the very name of the science, kalam, means nothing else than speech, conversation, or even debate. And the person who engaged in it was called a mutakallim. But the question about the origin of the debating style, which characterizes kalam works, is only one aspect of the question about the origin of Islamic theology. Scholars who advocate externalist theories also look at the sorts of problems Islamic theologians came to discuss in order to trace the origin of their science. Here, the Christian connection has been suggested once more. Some of the earliest debates among Islamic theologians we know of revolved around the question of divine predestination and human free will. This was a central theological problem among Christian theologians as well, as these scholars point out. In addition, our primary sources mention that one of the earliest Islamic theologians, a certain Ma'bad ibn Abdallah ibn Uqaym al-Juhani from Basra in Iraq, learned about the predestination free will debate from a Christian called Susan. This account, however, should maybe be taken with a grain of salt, as other scholars have noted. Unfortunately, detailed information about the beginnings of kalam are scarce, as many early texts have not come down to us, and the texts that have survived date from a later time and are often polemical and tendentious in nature. Polemical in the sense that they seem to want to discredit the theological views held by certain individuals. So it might be that reports, such as the one about MacLeod adopting his position in the predestination free will debate from a Christian, also implicitly seek to discredit his position by presenting it as un-Islamic. Well, now that we have an idea of what the externalist theories have to say about the origin of the science of kalam, what about the internalist theories? Scholars who subscribe to the internalist theory have pointed out that both the characteristic debating style as well as the very word that came to denote the science of Islamic theology, namely kalam, were used by Muslims well before they came into contact with Christian theologians. Rather, the term and the debating style go back to the times of Muhammad and his early Muslim community. This is evidenced, proponents of the internalist theory argue, by reports that go right back to the early times of the Muslim community. In one of these reports, Muhammad encounters a group of Muslims, quote, discussing about the issue of predestination, yatakalamuna fil qadar. Here, we already have the term in question, yatakalamuna, which is the verb corresponding to the noun kalam. In another report, Ibn Abbas discusses with some Kharijites about their revolt against the fourth rightly guided Caliph Ali. Without going into the details of this historical episode now, the Kharijites were a renegade group who had initially supported Ali's claim to leadership, but then were disappointed by his way of handling a, well, let's just call it delicate political situation, and consequently turned away from him, not, however, without causing havoc among the Muslim community. In any case, in the report, Ibn Abbas discusses with the Kharijites by presenting them with alternative views, and he actually manages to win some of them back by exposing their position as inconsistent with the Quran. Speaking of the Quran, proponents of the internalist theory also argue that the Quran itself was a prime example for Islamic theologians of how to argue with one's opponents. This is not to say that the Quran presents itself as a systematic book of theology, but it means that the Quran oftentimes supports its message by argument and by refuting opposing views. Take as an example the following excerpt from the 75th surah or chapter of the Quran. By the day of resurrection, does man think we, that is God speaking, shall not put his bones back together? Was he, that is man, not just a drop of spilled out sperm, which became a clinging form, which got shaped in due proportion, fashioning from it the two sexes, male and female? Does he who can do this not have the power to bring the dead back to life? So here the Quran is concerned with refuting those who doubted the possibility that humans should be resurrected after they died and their remains were scattered to the four winds. The Quran presents something of an analogical argument. If God is able, as even those who doubted the resurrection acknowledged, to create humans the first time, should he then not be able to create them a second time on the day of resurrection? Another Quranic verse, which the proponents of the internalist theory of the origin of Islamic theology like to quote, is Quran 16:125. This verse admonishes Muhammad as the proclaimer of the Quranic message to, quote, call to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good teaching, and to, quote, argue with them in the most courteous way. This verse is then seen as evidence that Islamic theologians did not have to look very far, and certainly not outside their own tradition, in order to find a paradigm for their theological debates and forms of argument. The conclusion one scholar therefore reaches is that, quote, kalam originated completely in the Islamic environment, and foreign elements came only later as a result of mixing with other nations. Seeing that the precise origin of the science of kalam evidently still lies very much in the dark, we might actually wonder whether these different theories have to be that mutually exclusive. Maybe there is some truth to all of them. To the ones that emphasize the role of encounters with other faiths in their long-standing tradition of debate, and the ones that emphasize what Muslims might have found in their own religious tradition that contributed to the emergence of the science of kalam. So, since our written records of the early beginnings of kalam are scarce, we only know of the very early theological schools and their positions from later sources. And I already mentioned that we should ask the question to what extent these later sources faithfully state the view of previous generations of theologians, especially if they have a clear polemical undertone. But let this not discourage us. Let's have a look at what we know about one early theological group, even if we have to take this with a grain of salt. This is the Qadariyya. The Qadariya emerged towards the end of the 7th century during the Umayyad dynasty. Apparently, this group had a particular concern for moral questions. Their core tenet was that humans are responsible for their actions. This implied for them that humans have a free will and that not everything is predetermined by God. The name of this group, Qadariyya, really is a case of nomen est omen, meaning the name is a sign, as the Latin proverb goes. The term Qadar was used to designate God's predestination of events. So it is quite fitting that the Qadariyya, with their focus on this specific theological problem, should take their name from the term Qadar. Even though it must be noted that this name might actually have been a pejorative label applied to them by their opponents, rather than the name the group should have chosen for themselves. In any case, the Qadariyya's insistence on human free will and responsibility went hand in hand with another core tenet. God does not create humans' evil and sinful actions because he is good. The Qadariyya was definitely not a proper theological school yet, with a set of fixed doctrines. It rather seems that individuals who shared the position on human free will and responsibility for sinful actions were put together under this label. Not much is known about other theological positions which the Qadariyya might have held, for example about Judgment Day or God's other attributes, aside from his goodness, which one could expect must have played a role for the Qadariyya as well. What's interesting is that the Arabic sources remember the Qadariyya not only as a theological group, but also for their political involvement. The alleged founder of the Qadariyya, the aforementioned MacLeod, who apparently learned about the issue of predestination from a Christian called Susan, was actually a respected member of the Umayyad elite, the dynasty that ruled the Muslim empire after the 4 rightly guided caliphs. Ma'bad is said to have held the prestigious position of ambassador to the Byzantine Empire, and he even functioned as tutor to the son of one Umayyad caliph. The same is true of Ma'bad's most famous pupil, Ghailan ad-Dimashqi, who was the director of the mint in the Umayyad bureaucracy. However, as we know from history, such prestigious positions can be rather fleeting, and Ma'bad and Ghailan both suffered the fate of falling from caliphal grace and ending up being executed. The Arabic sources indicate that Ma'bad and Ghailan's theological positions came to be seen as a challenge of the political authorities. The core tenet of the Qadariya, that humans are responsible for their actions, especially sinful ones, was seen to directly challenge the Umayyad state doctrine that the caliph was God's representative on earth, whose authority and actions should not be questioned, and who deserved complete obedience. This self-image of the Umayyads was reflected in the term Khalifat Allah, or deputy of God, which they used for themselves, rather than the arguably less assuming Khalifat Rasul Allah, or deputy of the messenger of God, which the rightly guided caliphs before the Umayyads had chosen. The Umayyad authorities were probably not that wrong after all, with their suspicion that the Qadariyya's theological position had little favorable political implications, as Ma'bad is said to have participated in an anti-Umayyad revolt, and Ghailan is said to have incurred the caliph's anger when he started to preach his theological beliefs openly. The Qadariyya was rather short-lived and lasted only some 50 years until the end of Umayyad rule in the middle of the 8th century. For us ardent listeners of the Kalamopod, however, the Qadariyya is of interest also insofar as one of the most important theological schools, the Mu'tazila, would grow out of it. Many Mu'tazilis, for their part, were apparently not very happy about their own theological affiliation with the notorious Qadariyya, and Arabic biographical works dating back to the first few centuries of Islamic history consequently downplay the continuity in theological dogma. In any case, what the Qadariyya shows us is that classical Islamic theologians were not simply sitting in their lofty ivory towers and doing their theology business, but that theology could easily get entangled in politics. Theology could then become a life-threatening business, and this is what happened again less than 100 years after the Qadariyya, when one Abbasid caliph decided that an inquisition was in order, which would bring some theologians the support of the state, while others would face the fate of being flogged. But this story has to wait till the next episode of the Kalamopod, the one and only podcast on themes in classical Islamic theology, hosted by Hannah Alvine. Thanks for listening, and hear you soon.